Hi, good morning, everyone. Just going to give it a moment for all the attendees to come in, and we'll get started in just a moment. All right, also in the chat, you'll notice I just shared a link to the NJDEP model tree ordinance that will be referenced throughout today's presentation. So if you do not have that, you can check the chat for the link to the ordinance. We'll be bringing up the relevant sections during the presentation, but if you'd like to open that, see the link there. So good morning, I'm Christina Schwartz. I'm the Executive Director for the New Jersey Association of Planning and Zoning Administrators, and also the Land Use Director and Zoning Official for the Township of Reddington, Hunterdon County. Again, we're excited to welcome everyone back for session 2 in this 3-part series covering tree removal and replacement ordinances in New Jersey. So for those of you that were not on session 1, I'd like to remind you that this is a 3-session series, and it is a collaboration between NJAPZA, which I'm the executive director, that serves planning and zoning officials throughout the state, and the New Jersey Shade Tree Federation. So we're happy to partner on this very relevant topic to both of our organizations. This came to be when we both had a lot of questions following the 2023 League of Municipalities conference about the NJDEP tree ordinance requirement, and also just tree ordinances in general and what would be appropriate for municipalities and how they should make these regulations for their communities. So excited to bring you session 2 today. As we get started, I'd like to just mention to the group, if you didn't join us for session 1, when we send out the slides for session 2, so we will send an email to everyone who joined today. You will get it to the email address you joined today's session with. It will have an attachment with the slide deck, so if you do not see it by sometime tomorrow, check your spam, please. There will also be a link there to watch the session 1 video. There's a password for that. So if you'd like to catch up, if you're joining us today or need to go back to revisit any information, you will see the link to the session 1 video there. So for those of you that were with us for session 1, we have Neil Hendrickson returning today. Neil is an industry expert with over 30 years of experience as a practicing arborist. He obtained his master's in forest science from the University of New Hampshire, as well as his PhD in silviculture and forestry from Yale University. Neil is currently the president of the New Jersey Shade Tree Federation, and we're very excited to have him with us today. He's currently retired from the Bartlett Research Laboratory, but remains a full schedule with speaking engagements and volunteer efforts in his local community and throughout the state. And Neil is a certified arborist, an NJ certified tree expert, and a member of the Society of American Foresters. We also, from NJ Shade Tree Federation, have Rich Wallowitz with us here today. And we're excited to have him join us on session 2. He's the NJ Shade Tree Federation Executive Director. He has held that position with them for the last 3 years, but has been a member of the NJ Shade Tree Federation for about 38 years. He's an NJ licensed certified tree expert, ISA certified arborist, and a utility specialist. He is the founder of Richview Consulting and has an arboricultural career that spans over 40 years. His career encompasses extensive municipal and utility experience, and he is a graduate of Cook College, Rutgers University. Lastly, I'd like to welcome back James Clavelli. He's a professional planner, consultant with the firm of Clark Caton Hintz here in New Jersey. I know many of the municipalities represented here today work with his firm, CCH, and even James directly. He obtained his Master of City and Regional Planning degree with a concentration in land use from Rutgers University Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. James became a planner because he felt it was a practical profession that has a real impact on the people's lives and the communities in which they live. And being a planner allows James to do what he loves most, which is working with people and helping to improve communities in which he works. He's experienced in many aspects of planning, including drafting of master plan elements, redevelopment studies, ordinance development, affordable housing, and site plan review. So thank you to our panelists for lending their time and talents to us again today as we embark on session 2 of the series. So for our session today, this is the outline. We will be having a brief recap of what was covered in session 1. Again, if you'd like to go into more detail on that, you can revisit the session 1 resources, which we have a video we can also share to everyone attending today. We'll go over a general ordinance structure review. We'll be going then section by section through the NJDEP model ordinance. And while we do that, taking the opportunity to pull in examples from a variety of municipalities throughout New Jersey to see how different municipalities are addressing some of these sections of the ordinance. We'll also focus on the factors you want to consider when developing a tree ordinance that's appropriate for your community, and also highlighting opportunities for your municipality and your community to engage the proper stakeholders in this process. And that might be municipal officials, community groups, commissions in your township, to making your ordinance a success. So briefly to recap session 1, this was a slide that we shared in the session 1 presentation about the NJDEP's tree removal and replacement ordinance requirement. And it's required to be adopted and enforced to control tree removal, replacement, and must be adopted before May 1st, 2024. Now, our DEP representative on the first session talked extensively about that deadline and what you can do to communicate with your DEP representative or case manager if you're not going to hit that deadline of May 1st. There's some resources that we have on a slide at the end of this session as well that you can reference to get in touch with your case manager, to submit an ordinance that you already have in the works for feedback. Just keep them advised of where you are in the process. Now, this tree ordinance requirement is going to apply to all 557 Tier A municipalities, and that includes the 101 that were reassigned to Tier A municipalities. And again, that was covered in more detail in session 1. So just to set the ground for what we're going to cover today, the NJDEP's model ordinance is a template. It's not required to be adopted as is. We've encountered other mandates like that with model ordinances, but this is not one. They are giving this as guidance that municipalities can use to comply with the requirement, but you also have the ability to adopt this model ordinance in part or modify an ordinance that you already have at your municipality, or develop a truly customized, bespoke version as long as it meets the minimum permit standards. And those were highlighted to be, it covers tree removal, it covers tree replacement, and it applies to all lands within the jurisdiction of your municipality. So we'll talk more specifically about setting some of these appropriate parameters for your township. But what we'd like to have you take away as we start here is you have a lot of flexibility to make your ordinance work for your community. There's a lot of opportunities to work with those stakeholders in your community, your municipal officials, see what's important for your community to regulate, your ability to regulate some of these things, and really develop an ordinance that's going to work for you. So now I'd like to hand over this section of the presentation to James Calvelli to talk about ordinance structure.
Good morning, everybody. And Christina, thank you for introducing me earlier. So some of us on this call may have experience reading or preparing ordinances, but I understand that there may be many who do not. So as a brief overview, ordinances act as laws at the local level and are passed by the governing body. So that might be a township committee, a borough council, etc. Formats can vary, but they have a general structure to them in New Jersey, which starts with an introduction or a purpose, right? That can be one sentence. It could be several paragraphs. It could be quite long, which indicates the reason for the ordinance and what it is meant to accomplish and what is being regulated. So it's a means of communicating to individuals in your municipality as to why you're doing what you're doing. And we'll show some examples of that. Next, and what's very important, are definitions. Ordinances can be their own world in a way, and so within them, there may be specialized terms that are technical or legal in nature, which you will want to define so that people can understand those terms in the actual regulations, a regulatory section of the ordinance. And in this example, the model ordinance has definitions that are required or suggested. And then we have examples of definitions that other municipalities use that go beyond what is recommended or required by the model ordinance. The most important section, kind of the meat of any ordinance, are the regulations themselves. So for folks who might be familiar with zoning, these may be setbacks or something like that, right? A requirement for what you can do. It can consist of one or more sections, which we'll see here. The regulation sections in the model ordinance is broken down into 3 distinct sections. And this is the teeth of the ordinance, right? This is what is measurable and enforceable. And so if somebody meets the requirement, great. If they don't, and there's no exemption, you may need to have some sort of enforcement mechanism like a fine or something like that. And these can be followed by other sections such as enforcement, fees, violations, and additional legal sections such as severability. And we suggest that any ordinance that is prepared by a municipality be done so in consultation with a municipal attorney, as these are ultimately legal documents. Okay, so the NJDEP tree removal and replacement model ordinance, which we're here to discuss today, the model template has 8 sections: the purpose, definitions, regulated activities, exemptions, enforcement, violations and penalties, severability, and the effective date. We're primarily going to focus on sections 1 through 4 during this session today, while sections 5, 6, 7, and 8, or 5, 6, and 7 will be more in detail in the 3rd session, and the effective date was discussed quite a bit in the first session, which can be rewatched as well. There's also a link to the ordinance here, and this will be sent out to the attendees after the presentation. Okay. So section 1, the purpose. The model ordinance provides a purpose which is pretty short and to the point: establishing requirements for tree removal and replacement, reduction of soil erosion and pollutant runoff, and promote infiltration of rainwater into the soil to protect public health, safety, and the environment. This is good enough, right? If this was what your ordinance would have, and you just obviously insert the name of your municipality, that's great. But for some municipalities, there's a desire to go beyond that. So on the next slide, we have an example from Reddington Township, which is broken into 2 sections, with the first indicating the importance of trees and shrubs and what they contribute from an aesthetic, economic, and ecological perspective to the Township of Reddington. And section B, which gives you the purpose and how trees control and regulate soil erosion, excessive heat, air and noise pollution, things of that nature. But I'll let Neil dive into that a little bit more deeply.
But actually, you covered it very well, James. We've already in the first session talked about the benefits of trees, and this is basically a recap of that. So I don't think there's a need to rehash it.
Great. Thank you, Neil. And just goes to say, if trees are very important to your community, make it as long and as detailed as you would like. Section 2 definitions is one of the more practical parts of any ordinance. Again, these are going to be very technical things. I know we have a lot of tree experts on the call today, so a lot of these terms may or may not be new to you, but for a lot of the general public, and I can include myself in this before I became a professional planner, a lot of these terms are going to be unusual or completely unfamiliar. So this would be advice I would give to any municipality for an ordinance, but specifically for this one, definitions are going to help create our world and let everybody who's affected by these regulations understand what the regulations mean in detail. There are definitions that are provided with the model ordinance. These can be modified, expanded, and of course, you can also add additional definitions, as we'll see. So the list of definitions given in the model ordinance include applicant, technical terms like critical root radius and diameter at breast height, which those terms are very important because those are the metrics by which we regulate, the value of a tree. So we'll expand on those. We put a star next to hazard tree. We're going to get into this in more detail towards the end of the presentation when we talk about exemptions, because we think that this is going to be the exemption that most municipalities encounter and the ones that you get the most questions on. So we're going to devote more time to that towards the end. Terms like person, like applicant, are just ways to identify, the individuals impacted. Planting strip, street tree, what is a tree, right? Versus a tree versus a shrub versus a plant. Tree calipers, another measurement, and tree removal, of course. What counts as tree removal and what is being regulated. But some municipalities will have additional regulations. So, for example, the city of Lambertville regulates or defines invasive plant. Okay, so an invasive plant has a negative impact. And so when we're replacing trees in Lambertville, they want to say you cannot have an invasive plant. And so defining that term allows you to say you're not allowed to do it. And that could be the case for anything, whether it's something you're looking to encourage or discourage. So if there is something that is important to your particular municipality, our recommendation would be, or one way to approach it would be to define it so that way you can then regulate it. So there are additional options or types of definitions that you can include. And some of the examples we have here are specimen tree, heritage tree, legacy tree, feature tree, or historically valuable trees. And the idea here is that these definitions may relate to your municipality if you have some tree like this. And so you can add these definitions. And so that way you can add additional regulations for them. And so, Neil, I think you want to jump into and kind of speak to what these mean and why they may be important.
Yeah, thank you. What you call it, whether you call it specimen, heritage, legacy, or any other term, that's also up to you. And you can probably find definitions for each on the internet. But mostly it's important to your municipality. For well-developed towns that have trees that are old and some that are really quite special, you can set a separate definition than those towns that don't have any old or special trees. The really issue is to define it. I've heard it defined as trees having unique value to your community. I think that's a great definition. And then it could be a tree you think is literally irreplaceable in anybody's lifetime or beyond. So if you've got a tree, if you've got the only 150-year-old tree in your town, that's a pretty likely candidate to be called an historically valuable or specimen tree. You might categorize those trees in like this, due to their age, their size, their aesthetic value. They're in a key location and they're either big or they're special in some way, or because you have an historic district in your town. That might be that a tree that wouldn't be a feature tree or a specimen tree elsewhere might be in historic part of your town. A perfect example in our own township, there is an historic district and someone removed a tree that was planted at the age of the house, which was early in the 20th century. And so that tree was definitely a tree. We now call that. We did not have that definition at the time. We do now. So you just need to consider the tree population, which we trust as you see as the last line. You need to know your tree population. You need to know where these trees are, how many might qualify, and whether you need this category at all. So that's pretty much it. You decide.
Neil, can you speak to the tree removal? So that's in a definition you're going to see in the model ordinance and in really any tree ordinance that has to regulate removal. You got to define that term. But in Reddington Township, we go beyond what many of us who are not in the tree world would define as tree removal to extend to activities that might destroy or injure a tree.
Sure. The removal in the model ordinance and how you might add it to your own town's definition of removal extends beyond having somebody put a chainsaw and dropping it at the base, removing the tree. If someone, for example, does construction, paves over the root system, what you don't see often kills trees more than what you do. It's often damage to the root system. And you see that mentioned here by things that can, by machinery, materials, storage, excavation, you see all those things. And the difficulty is the damage to trees that occurs, for example, in construction, which is a reason a lot of these ordinances are built, is that it might not occur immediately. And the planting requirements and all of that often require planting after removal within a year. But if the tree doesn't die, and a big tree might not die for years, I think the important thing in the removal aspect is that you document what has happened so that someone could be held accountable should that tree die after sometime after, say, beyond a year. But it also involves butchering a tree in other ways, like what we call flush cutting, not cutting back to where the proper branch color is, or applying something to your lawn. I've seen many trees that were killed by applying lawn chemicals that weren't intended to be applied near tree root systems. So there's a lot of things like that, but you'll see over and over the issue of roots and climbing practices such as spikes. Some people will still use them, but this will come back to in when we talk about the kinds of professionals you'd like to have come on your property, because if they are licensed, they're not likely to do any of these things. But you can also create sections in your ordinance to prevent all these things by protection of the tree's root zone, for example.
Thank you, Neil. And we'll even get into this in session 3, where we talk about your permit process and how you're going to enforce that at your municipal level. I've worked with Neil where he's going out to review planned removal. So they've told us how many trees they're removing and what their replanting is going to be. And after he visits the site to be there for that reason, and so sees that they are engaging in all these other activities that are going to be problematic down the road, and burying the trunks, and we note that, make the property owner aware, and flag that in our system to follow up. So we'll revisit that as we continue on in session 3. But again, that's why it's great that we have this in our ordinance, that you're engaging in activity that we indicate could be qualifying as tree removal. All right, James, would you like to talk about the other sections, the regulated activity in section 3?
Yes. So the regulated activities are divided into 3 categories. The optional application process, which we will spend very little time on. B, the tree replacement requirements, which we will spend quite a bit more time on and provide examples from different municipalities. And finally, alternatives to replacement. So if you're not going to replace a tree with other trees, you would then replace it with some kind of in lieu payment or fee. We'll discuss that. We'll discuss where that money could go and how it can be used.
And before we move on here, James, as you touched on, we're not going to spend time today talking about the optional application process. And we say optional because it says optional in the NJDEP model ordinance. But as we go through today's session, it'll kind of be apparent that how are you going to regulate removal and that the replacement's being done if you don't have some kind of application process at your municipality. So we're going to cover that in great detail in session 3. Outside of an application being in front of one of your land use boards, or the planning board, zoning board, combined board, there's going to be maybe no record of this type of work. So you're going to want to most likely develop some kind of application process, and we'll discuss that in more detail, review some different processes in different towns and see what's working and what might work for your municipality.
Okay. So, and that's section A, is the application process. And thank you, Christina. I didn't mean to shortchange that. I just was focusing on my focus there. So apologies there. So section B is the most substantive language of the model ordinance. And this breaks down into 2 categories. So first, what is being regulated? And the answer to that is the removal of trees of a certain size. So the model ordinance has their recommended size or minimum thresholds, and then how the fees or replacements increase as those trees become larger. But we'll show how that threshold can change from municipality to municipality, depending on the environment and depending on what's important to that municipality. This is followed by the requirements. What happens after the tree is removed? Okay, so you've recorded it, there's been an application, so you can replace that tree with another tree or trees. That can either happen on the property or off the property, or you can provide a payment in lieu of planting a tree, and we can talk about those funds and how they can be used. Okay. So we're going to start by talking about the regulated activities in the model ordinance. So on the left, you'll see that replacement trees shall be an in-kind replacement of equal or greater size. They have to be planted within 12 months of removal. So you have a year from when the tree is removed to then replace it. The applicant will have to monitor the health of those trees for 2 years. If within those 2 years, a tree is damaged, destroyed, or removed, that will then have to be replaced again within 12 months. And I think this is very important. It is not permissible to allow these to be planted in containers or pots. They have to be planted in the ground. The table, or the example table that is provided in the ordinance, in the model ordinance, is broken down into 4 sections: category, tree removed and the size, replacement criteria, and the application fee. This is going to be different for the other municipalities. They simplify the tables basically to have tree size that's being removed, size and quantity of trees to replace it with, or the payment in lieu fee. And I think that's more likely to be how an ordinance will be constructed. The application fees, according to the model ordinance, are to be determined by the municipality. Theoretically, they could change depending on the number or size of trees being removed. I imagine the fee will mostly be a flat fee, and that the variations will come in the penalties or fees themselves. So the table and the recommendations that they provide is they create 4 categories of tree. Category 1 includes street trees that are at least 2.5 inches in diameter at breast height, or DBH, but all street trees are replaced in the same way. Category 1 for other trees, so they separate street tree and other tree. Category 1 is 6 to 12.99 dBH. And when you replace those, you replace one tree that has a minimum 1.5 inch caliper. And the categories and the recommendations as you increase to category 2, it's 2 trees of that size that you replace it with. As you get to category 3, 23 to 33 inches, it's 3 trees of that minimum size. And category 4 encompasses trees that are 33 inches of DBH or greater, so it could become these massive trees, and they're to be replaced with 4 trees of 1.5 minimum caliber. So those are general rules. This can be adopted by your municipality, but as we'll see in the following slides, different towns handle this differently.
Thanks, James. I'm going to go to the next township, but before you go into how these differ, just some chat I'm seeing. This is one of those customizable elements we're talking about, where you're going to see that these charts differ between different types of municipalities. The fees are going to change. There's some questions about how much is charged. That's where you might want to involve some stakeholders, your environmental commission, shade tree, of what these replacement costs might be to give appropriate values. So these are some of those customizable features. You have to regulate the removal, so some way to categorize it. They're recommending some type of chart, but you can address it in any way that fits your municipality. So I'm going to hand it back over to James to go through some examples now, and this one is Reddington Township.
And thank you for that clarification, Christina. So the 3 examples that we picked, my intention was to have a rural community, which I would categorize Reddington. It's suburban and rural, but also very rural. A suburban example, which will be Ewing Township, and a more densely populated kind of traditional town pattern, which is the city of Lambertville. So with Reddington Township, they don't regulate trees as small as 2.5 inches, like what is indicated in the model ordinance. They start at 6 inches at that threshold. And you'll see with their replacement trees that they don't require a 1.5 inch caliper replacement. They require a 3 inch caliper replacement. I'm going to very generally state that in many instances, when you start at the larger size, it creates a greater opportunity for that tree to survive. But I will let Neil and Rich speak more to that beyond what I understand. So, but when you remove their version of category 1, which is DBH of 6 to 17 inches, automatically requires a replacement of 2 trees, not 1, like in the model ordinance. So if you replace a tree of that size, they will be getting more trees, or you have a fee of $400 for the removal of a tree of that size. And again, that fee was determined by the municipality. That can be determined however the municipality wants to determine that cost, or as we'll see with Ewing Township, they tie it to a regularly updated list based off of the price of trees. So that would be another mechanism for doing it. You tie it to some kind of living database of some sort. And you'll see with Reddington that as the tree gets larger, 17 to 31, there's a 4 tree replacement. The fee doubles, DBH of 31 to 38, 6 trees, and the fee goes to $1,200. And they have their threshold, their third level RET threshold at the 38, and then anything for 38 inches or greater. So these are those very massive trees. It's 8 trees to replace, or $1,600.
And James, just to jump in, especially now if you're talking about legacy or historic trees, what these are not only the prices you might ask to replace trees, but also the amount of disincentive you'd like to create to have those trees removed. So, for example, you could put an enormous price on an historic tree. If someone removes it, and I have seen this in different ordinances around the state, I have seen numbers upwards of $4,000 or $5,000, because the idea is don't remove that tree without a good reason. So, and then that, of course, would have to be identified by an appropriate professional. So that's just another thing there. But you can set the prices depending on what you're trying to accomplish. whether you're trying, and the same with the numbers.
And Neil, to piggyback on that, so we don't have that category presently, but because of it's something you're going to have to revisit. So you're going to make your best effort the first time around, get your ordinance adopted. If this is new to your municipality, many of you already have existing tree ordinances where you're looking for opportunities to, better that, tailor it better to your community, address issues you've encountered. So here, like in Reddington, we're looking to add another line to our chart to account for those legacy trees or historically important trees and set an appropriate fine there, because that is something that we've now encountered. So just to highlight that whoever is responsible for this or all the stakeholders can keep track of, amendments you want to make, things that are working, things that are not, and keep. You don't update your ordinance all the time, but keep a running list and talk about that with everyone involved in the process to see what changes might need to be made. Move to the next municipality to see how Lambertville, city of Lambertville. James, you want to go through what's different here?
Yes. So Lambertville, again, is it's a town, right? So that it has a high density. It's a small municipality, but it's bunched together and has a kind of an urban footprint, right? So narrow streets, sidewalks, dense houses, small lot sizes, things of that nature. So when they define it, the language that they use is related to shade trees, and they actually start with quite a small DBH or diameter at breast height to begin their threshold, which is 1 inch, right? That's below the 1.5 and certainly below the 6 that we saw in Reddington. And this, in an urban area or an area with sidewalks or that's densely populated, you might not start with a larger tree size or caliber, right? Because it's more likely you would want to start with something smaller that might be appropriate if you have a small area to plant, a small sidewalk, etc. And so smaller trees in a municipality that's urban or densely populated or portions of a municipality that may be like that, those smaller trees have more value in that urban context than they might have in a rural context where there's a number of trees and the value is really in those larger, more established ones. So they require a 1-to-1 replacement for those smaller sizes, 1 to 5 or 1 to 4.99 inches, but their fees are quite a bit higher. So $500 to replace one. Once you get to the 5 to 11 inch category, you replace them with 2 trees, and they have $1,000 replacement fee if you do payment in lieu. 11 inches to 17 inches, 3 trees required for replacement, and $1,500 in lieu planting fee. And the DBH of 17 inches or greater, 4 trees, and $2,000. And again, this speaks to the type of trees that you're likely to encounter. When you have sidewalks and pavement and streets and buildings everywhere, right, rather than these kind of large lots and small development, when you have the opposite of that, those smaller trees have more value. They have more value for aesthetics. They have more value for their stormwater control or ability to impact soil erosion and sediment. They also have a heat island effect value. They provide shade during hot days as days become warmer, and this reflects that. They also,
James, I'm sorry, and just to interject, the reason that small trees have more value is because a lot of these trees are in sidewalks in limited soil volume. Then they're not likely to live as long. The functional life of these trees is not the same as the biological life of the trees if they were grown in a native habitat. So along streets, if you're only going to get a tree to 15 or 20 years before it runs out of root space, then it's obvious that a much smaller tree has the higher value. No, just to expand on what James said.
I appreciate that. And for the folks on the call, getting to work with Neil has been great in Reddington Township. I've learned a lot of the technical aspects of tree planting. And so that advice is excellent for in that context and is excellent for the folks on the call who may be in more densely populated communities that have sidewalks and things of that nature. Also, just a note on Lambertville is within their ordinance for tree replacement is quite large. So they get into the specifics of sizes, species, and things like that in other sections of their ordinance. They don't have that in their table, whereas Reddington includes all of your replacement trees have a minimum caliper of 3 inches. So just a slight difference between the two tables there as well.
And James, I'm going to pop to the next municipality here, but before you start talking about this, I see a bunch in the questions here about the fees.
Mhm.
Reddingtons are noticeably lower, and Neil, you can probably speak to this as well. In our community, we often find that people are not paying into the tree escrow fund, especially homeowners who are doing projects. They have lots large enough where they can accommodate the replanting on site. They often want to replant on site so they can benefit from the additional screening, trees, landscaping. And in other municipalities, you might not see that. So maybe you do set your fees higher to offset any canopy loss. Neil, does that seem appropriate?
Yeah, and in fact, it's mostly unattainable in this world, but we operate on the principle of no net loss, where we'd love to be able to maintain our tree canopy. Most of you will probably see that the older trees, as people take them down, they replace them with flowering trees or smaller trees, and that the number of shade trees are actually decreasing. So it might not be the exact answer, but the issue here is that is try to maintain the urban forest canopy for all of its benefits to the best of your ability.
Right. Thank you. And I think so questions about fees, size of replacement, things like that. As everyone on this call knows, there are 565 municipalities in the state. They vary considerably, right? They vary in terms of physical characteristics, of built environment characteristics, environment, ecosystem, etc. Right? And that's great. However, it means that the way you construct your fee schedule, your tree replacement schedule, it will vary, right? And so for municipalities where it's important to have a fund or a program where those trees are replaced in a particular way, the fees may be higher for that reason, right? So I think the questions about fees are great, but I will say that's really a value determination that's based off of your particular municipality.
And
The
James,
next,
what you said there too, a couple of questions that came up are that the prices don't reflect the cost of getting a tree in the ground. So it depends on this. If you decide, for example, if your town does not have a lot of available space to plant trees, and you put it in the escrow fund, then if a storm comes by, and you need to plant large trees, it's going to be much more expensive. So your fee schedule needs to reflect what you expect to plant and where.
yeah, and I went through a number of different. I have the pleasure of working in Reddington and Lambertville, which was why when I was looking for examples, those were two that was pretty straightforward for me to call up. They're also very different types of communities, so that helps to speak to variety. But when I was looking, I picked Ewing for a reason, and that's because they have this interesting TBD tree replacement value. So first thing you'll see that they have a difference in their sizes, a little bit different than Reddington, which is 6 to 12 in its first category. Ewing is 6 to 10, so a slight difference there. They also have, when you remove one tree of that size, it's a replacement of one tree of a smaller size. When you replace two trees of that size, they ask that you replace it with one slightly larger tree, right? I wasn't involved. I don't work in that community. I'd be interested to know where that came from, but my guess is it comes from some understanding of the municipality where there was a feeling that would be an effective way to replace trees. And then their schedule kind of progresses not too dissimilarly from our other communities, just slightly different thresholds, slightly different size requirements. But they also, once you get to the larger trees, allow you to have a replacement of 4 larger trees or 6 smaller trees. 30 inches or greater, 5 larger trees, or 7 smaller trees. That's an interesting way to approach it, and it might be something that works or makes sense for your municipality. But what I would like to focus on is the tree replacement value. So they star that, and they include a note in their ordinance, which says that the value of the in lieu payment fee will be determined by current wholesale values posted annually by the township for the current year. The advantage to this is, and as folks on this call who work with municipal councils, committees, etc., passing ordinances is hard, right? It takes time, it involves stakeholder engagement, and as we'll briefly go over later, the statutory requirements build in a time lapse between when you introduce and when you pass things. When it's a zoning ordinance, it has to go to the planning board and the municipal, the governing body. So tying it to something that can be updated, some kind of database that could be, that's, living as a way to think about it, or can be changed, helps you to not have to go through that process to change your ordinance again in the future, right? So cost of things go up and down based on the year, based on supply and demand, based on availability, things like that. And so this allows the municipality to say, the fee is going to change. You'll see the change in fee. It's based on a wholesale price on our website. I think that's effective. You may also apply that to your list of replacement tree species types. If you have someone like Neil in your community who may be able to maintain that and has that expertise, or a committee that has that expertise, someone you can designate, that allows you to change your replacement trees based on, if there's a different blight or infection for trees, or if there's, it was announced by the USDA that some of the zones in New Jersey have changed due to increase in temperatures. So tying things to these kind of living databases can be a useful way to deal with changes in the future without having to make changes to your ordinance. And unfortunately, I think Christina had a technical issue.
Yeah,
And so
can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Your picture is frozen, but I can hear you.
Yeah, can you, what are you seeing on the screen? It says my share is it still the Ewing chart?
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna have to share. Sorry, everybody. Where we are now is regulated activities for replacement trees. And Neil and Rich, if you could talk here now while I redo the share, this is where we're going to talk about what guidance municipalities can provide in replanting. So that would include any street trees lists, invasives versus do not plant lists. If you guys could get started on that while I reshare the presentation.
All right, Rich. Among the issues that we came up with, James and Christina and I locally. You can move on if you want to, Christina, because there you go. All right.
Yeah. Okay, we're back in business, everyone.
You're back in business. So as far as street tree lists, Rich could tell you, but I can too, that the Shade Tree Federation has a booklet called Street Trees for New Jersey Streets, which is excellent. And it hasn't been updated in a while, but it's certainly relevant. Last time I looked at it, it's very accurate. You can certainly come up with an invasive list. There are so many ways to identify invasive lists that Christina can send you the links on that or post the links on it. But as far as invasives, there's the National Invasive Species Information Center. Even the DEP has an invasive species list. But they do change. For example, I was at a conference last week, and there was someone there who's collecting data from a broad spectrum of stakeholders on what trees that we thought were okay are becoming invasive. There may not be a species most of you know, but suddenly, out of nowhere, the Ammermachia, which was considered a fine street tree, is now considered invasive. So this should be a dynamic thing, because they change. They change with, as James is saying, they change with the planting, the hardiness zones changing too. Natives versus adapted, that is probably one of the biggest issues out there. The natives have a strong following, and there's nothing wrong with natives, but consider that they might not be the best for a given area. No trees are adapted to urban areas. They are adapted to growing somewhere in the woods. And sometimes trees that are adapted to our area, and that's quite a few, mostly from areas that are our same latitude and climate, they work just fine. And adapted or introduced does not mean invasive. There's plenty of trees that do very well that are not invasive, that are well adapted. So with the world changing, we also would say native to where? Red oak, for example, is native from Maine to basically Georgia. And so is red maple, but there are some like sugar maples that were native, but they're fading out because the temperature is changing and the hardiness zones are changing. So when you decide to go with only natives, be careful. Read the literature, because wildlife can get used to adapted trees. Pollinators will. So it's a long and complicated discussion, and I'll keep it to that. Although just don't get married to any one description of plant. What's going to be, as someone once said at a conference I heard, we should be planting native to Richmond now and Atlanta in 5 years. So just be aware that this whole idea of what to plant, natives versus adapted, is dynamic.
Sorry about that. I would think that of course, the resources are there, but one of the key things to keep in mind is work with your other environmental groups in your town, your environmental commissions, your shade tree commissions. Also see what's growing good in your area. It's hard to put in writing what's good down in Cape May County versus something that's good up in Warren. You have to judge it by soil structure and everything else that you have to consider in that environment. But above all, don't go into I love this type of tree, I'm going to plant it every place in my town. Once you do a monoculture, you have a problem. As you can see what's happening now with our ash trees, or what happened to the elm trees years ago. So information's out there, use it and talk to people. It's really good stuff.
Yep, and just to expand just a little bit on street tree lists, just that diversity has been the watchword for every place, towns, landscapes. And so the idea, if you've never heard of the term, the 10-20-30 rule, it means no more than 10% of a species, 20% of a genus like oaks, or 30% of a family, which is even broader, which includes beeches, oaks. So, and that itself is, the data show it's very hard to achieve. But one of the things you'll find, as Rich just mentioned about ash trees, is ash trees were planted as monocultures to replace elms, among other things. Every time we replace trees with monocultures, we lose a lot of trees. So the idea is to, if you have species lists, is look for as many possibilities to diversify your urban landscape that you can, because the world is becoming harsher and we are not getting any fewer invasive insects and diseases. So diversity is the watchword to go by.
Thank you, everyone. And Neil, I know we had an example of this with a new home construction where there was a lot of trees to be removed. They followed our charts for replacement, and they even had to pay. So they did a combination. They replaced on site and did some payment into the tree escrow fund, but proposed to plant nearly all the same tree on site. And after a conversation with Neil of why this was a bad idea, they really appreciated the feedback and adjusted their replanting requirement there.
Yep. And I think both Rich and James have mentioned this, so I'll just add, we did have one case, and this is sort of related to the slide that's just come up. When someone wanted to build out to the limits of a site, they didn't have enough room to plant the trees they wanted to plant, and the plant choices were poor ones. So James's firm and I, we spoke to them and said, it would be better if you planted these other species. The trouble was they had proposed medium-sized at maturity trees, and the specification was for trees that would be large. And when they couldn't build to the side they wanted to put all the trees on a much more limited space. So what happens is you would have crowded them into an area that wouldn't have supported them to meet a legal requirement, but the trees would not have survived because there's a soil volume requirement. So in our ordinance, for example, we have a square footage that you need to have to replant according to the size of the tree. So for example, 1,000 square feet, we assume the soil is, since we can't assume depth, we take a shot that it's adequate. But we say 1,000 feet, and it's not in our ordinance yet, but we've discussed this because what we're interested in is survival, to get trees to grow to their design size, not to assume that they're going to only live 7 to 10 years. So if you want to avoid serial replacement, which is not today's version of sustainability, if you want to get the tree to its design size, you need to have adequate soil volume. So you might choose to specify, for example, 1,000 square feet for a large tree, 600 for a medium-sized tree like a magnolia, a crabapple, something like that, and say half that for a small tree. Just one of those things that is worth considering when you're planting, because you don't want your plantings to fail.
Thank you for that, Neil. So this slide, what we're getting into is section C of the regulations of the model ordinance, which talks about replacement alternatives. And so we're going to see two versions of this, one when to plant on site and when to plant off site. And then we'll talk about where payment in lieu fees can go to ensure planting later on. So these two examples, neither of which are from New Jersey. That way I didn't highlight anybody by accident on the call, both from Connecticut. On the left is an example of a very large property. I believe it's in the realm of 5 to 6 acres, where if a tree was removed for some sort of project for the homeowner or property owner, it may be appropriate to replace it on site. You have the space for it. It's a wooded area, so the context is appropriate. And so that would be potentially a good area for on-site replacement of trees. On the right, you have a more urban area. So this is from New Haven, Connecticut, where, yes, there's a tree in the backyard of this property, but if they were to remove that for some reason and you wanted to replace it, replacing it in that backyard may not be the best option. It might be better instead to plant it in a particular street, a park, or some other area that the municipality has an interest in replanting trees. So these are just two different ways to look at that, and something that I come across quite a bit. I also just want to speak to a point. I mentioned this in session 1, but just as to reiterate, because Neil brought up a specific instance where our firm worked with him to review a plan in Reddington Township. You don't have to include this as part of a zoning ordinance, but when you do, when there's a site plan, when there's a variance plan or application, it gives your planning or engineering or landscape architecture consultants the opportunity to look at these tree removal and replacement plans and things like that, and to offer professional advice or or suggestions that will help not only make sure that the provisions are included per the ordinance, but also that they're done in a thoughtful way that the applicant may not have thought of. And so, again, you don't have to include it as part of the zoning ordinance, but when you do, it opens up that possibility at the planning and zoning board level. Okay. So when we think about replacement alternatives, we have a few examples of where to plant those trees off-site. So you can determine areas that are desirable for tree planting. For example, you could create a shade tree or street tree zone. Sometimes when we create, for example, redevelopment plans, we'll divide wide sidewalks into clear zones, street tree zones, and street furniture zones. And so the street tree zone would be of a particular width plants would be required to be planted in a particular way. And that zone may be an area where you could have your tree replacement trees go, or your funds from your in lieu fees go. You can have areas designated for beautification. So if you have an untreed street or avenue that's prominent, or you'd like to make prominent, or it's a residential street and you'd like to just make it more attractive, or for folks who may be doing a complete streets program or trying to increase walkability and bikeability, having street trees as a separation between cars and pedestrians and things like that, you could identify those specific streets. And, I'm biased as a planner, but I'd always recommend planning ahead and coming up with the parts of your community where you would like to focus on tree planting. Then there's, of course, recreational areas such as parks, trails, or other preserved lands. These are great candidates as places to plant trees, additional trees, things like that. And then finally, as a practical matter, where new sidewalks are proposed, the inclusion of a tree zone can be determined, and you can also determine as you're building your sidewalks that they're the appropriate width and size for tree healthy planting, or to the extent that you could plant trees in an urban area in a healthy and sustainable manner, as Neil alluded to earlier. That would be another option as well. And another specific example, in Lambertville, they have a jurisdiction zone, which they very, very specifically defined: space bordering any public street, sidewalk, or pedestrian walkway, reserved for public purposes, inclusive of shade tree growth and protection. And it identifies the outer edge, where this is, and some other items there as well as the size of it, so extending 8 feet beyond the edge of the street. So, for example, you could direct your replacement trees or your in lieu fees to go towards replanting within the jurisdiction zone of a particular area. So this creates a jurisdiction zone on every public street and every sidewalk and every pedestrian walkway that's public. And so it makes it easier, or more manageable, to redirect those funds, redirect that tree planting to a specific area that has been identified ahead of time as a place where you would like to plant trees. And in this case, they specify shade trees. Christina, if you're there, we can go. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. So the other example, and I really like this, is in Ewing Township, which when you collect those in lieu funds, they have a tree planting and preservation fund that's detailed in their ordinance that creates very specific parameters for where those funds go towards and where those trees are replaced. So you can use those funds to provide for caring, pruning, and maintenance of trees on municipal land, right? So you collect those fees and they help to pay to maintaining some of those existing trees, which may be legacy trees, special trees, established trees, and mature trees. And this helps you to protect them and to continue to maintain them. You could use it for planting of trees and shrubbery on municipal land, which sometimes can be larger tracts of land, right? Open space property, public rights of way, areas where the municipality has control, where they can take those funds and they can direct and replant or maintain in a specific and progressive and logical manner determined by the folks in the town. Use it for reforestation, beautification of municipal land, preserving or maintaining of historic landmark or specimen trees, specifically spoken to earlier, and providing for trees under what they have as a residential tree planting program. So basically a means for residents to access some of that money as well to plant trees on their land. So it's a bias of mine. I like specifics in regulations and rules. I also, when you're collecting fees, to be able to say, when someone says, where's this fee going, to be able to point to this and say, here's where it's going. And I think that's useful for communicating and as well as just carrying out the purpose of the ordinance.
And James, just a couple of quick points is we talk a lot about planting, but not a lot about stewardship. And that's what this fund can be used for in a broad term. Also, recently heard a discussion by a group called Casey Trees that is a permanently funded but nonprofit in Washington, D.C. And what they use some of their money for is to convince people or offer to people to plant trees on private land when there isn't enough land on the strips, on the planting strips by sidewalks. So some people might not mind, and in fact might like it if you planted trees on their lawn, if you paid for it and did all the work. And that can be one of the uses of that money. And in fact, if you have a goal of a certain amount of percent of coverage in your municipality, in fact, in Washington, D.C., I forget the number, but they exceeded it by having these trees planted on private land because they ran out of municipal land. So another interesting and creative use of the money you might collect.
Thank you, Neil. And we have another example up here, again, to illustrate how this can be different from town to town. Reddington addresses the replacement alternative with we call it a tree escrow fund. So if the resident or the applicant cannot plant the replacement trees on their property, they have the ability to pay into what we call a tree escrow fund. This was a separate fund that was established, part of our ordinance. We even go as far as to detail how much of the fund can be used for the administrative cost used to administer this. And then it details some of the activities that the money can be used for in our township. It is under the discretion of the township committee, but they do work with our environmental commission on how the money should be maintained. So again, as we've been talking about all these regulations, they can differ from town to town and how you best need to utilize the money for your municipality. We also have in here, and we'll get into this more in section 3, if you need to have a consultant. In our municipality, we're very lucky that Neil is a volunteer to the township, but in many towns, you're not going to have that. You're going to have to hire a consultant. I know Rich on the call with us today works in several municipalities. So to verify some of these items, we're going to get more into this with exemptions in our next section here. You might have to dip into this money to have an expert come in and give your municipality some advice. All right, now, so as I mentioned, we're going to go into exemptions. Would you kick us off here, James?
Yes. So exemptions are very likely something that folks working in a municipality are going to be asked about quite a bit. So the model ordinance creates standards and criteria for trees or scenarios where you are exempt from paying the fee or having to replace the trees. You will require proper justification, which Neil and Rich will speak to a bit later. And there's the list of exemptions provided in the model ordinance, and then there are also some exemptions that could be put into a particular ordinance for particular reasons, right, for a specific town. So we'll go into some of those exemptions now. Okay, so in the model ordinance, you have 7 exemptions. Hazard tree is the one listed last, but I put it on top because I think this is the one that you're going to get the most questions on. So as I indicated earlier, we're going to really touch on this. But some of the other examples are, there is a provision for residences to remove fewer than 4 trees in a 5-year period, so 3 trees, provided they have a DBH less than 33 inches. So they can be fairly large trees, and that you can remove 3 of those in a 5-year period without penalty. So if you remove them all January 1, 2024, you can then remove 3 trees again starting in 2029, January 1. Next is tree farms, nurseries, orchards, and garden centers. If your business grows trees that you then remove to sell, you're not penalized. You're exempt from this requirement. The same goes for silviculture under an approved stewardship or woodland management plan. Trees removed as part of a municipal or state decommissioning plan. Trees removed in the instance of an NJDEP or US EPA environmental cleanup or habitat enhancement plan. And approved game management practices recommended by the NJDEP Fish and Game Department of Fish, Game, and Wildlife. So these are built-in exemptions. We'll speak more to hazard tree in the next slide.
And again, these are all in the template. So these can be adjusted, these can be changed to tailor to your community. I'm sure some municipalities represented here today, if they take down 4 trees, even in a 5-year period, that may be very significant to the makeup of your community. So you can address these as appropriate. We'll get into that more in a few slides of what kind of exemptions might be appropriate for the characteristics of your community.
So hazard trees. As a personal story, I lived in South Orange, New Jersey in 2012. I rented an apartment, and while I was falling asleep one night, a tree fell on the house I was staying in. That would be a hazard tree, right? And so folks remove trees that may present some kind of danger to health and human safety because they are diseased, they've been damaged by fire or storm, and they propose danger to a person, to property, roads, power lines, things like that. Those will not be required to pay a fee to be removed. There is a definition in the ordinance, though, as Neil is going to speak to, you know, in an ideal world, this would be more specific because we want to accomplish 2 things. One, if it is unsafe to people or property, removal is probably the right thing to do, and we don't want to penalize folks for doing that. However, we also don't want folks to use this as a means to remove trees that may not be a hazard. So I'm going to let Neil speak to that as well.
All right, thank you. Well, this is, I clearly don't have enough time because I could go on for hours. But for example, the definition in the model ordinance is trees that are infested with insects or disease. If you recall, a couple of years ago, we thought every tree was going to die from the lanternfly, which turned out to be very little. We had gypsy moths that we thought would kill all the oaks, and many recovered, so on and on like that. But the hazard tree issue is a big one, and there is, over the years, the industry of arboriculture has come up with a better way of looking at what is a hazard. We don't use the term. The term hazardous tree does not exist. The term is actually whether it's high risk or low risk. And for any of you who work outside of arboriculture in areas where risk is assessed, they use a matrix in which 2 major things are looked at. One is the likelihood of an event happening, in this case of a tree failure. And the second are what are the consequences. So a tree could be terribly defective and not a hazard tree. So this is why this qualification that's in our industry called TRAC, Tree Risk Assessment Qualification, was developed about 10 years ago, and why I'm such an advocate. So what you see there is a tree on the left. At Drew University, Bartlett, where I worked, was having a workshop there. And as we looked at this tree, we first were noted the lean and looked like it had been developing. And we saw all kinds of cracks along what you could call the spine of this tree that were relatively fresh. So what was the likelihood of failure? It was, there are 4 terms we use. Improbable, possible, probable, and imminent. This one we said was imminent. And what are the consequences? The consequences were simply that it could fall on a college campus, even if it's in the summertime. So they could have been significant, if not severe, if it hits a person. So we recommend that the area be cordoned off and the tree be removed. And by the next morning, when we reconvene for the second day of the workshop, you see the stump in the middle, that the tree had failed overnight. So clearly a hazard tree, but we called it a high risk because of the consequences and the imminence of its failure. In the bottom right picture, you'll see a tree with the things we've talked about. If you can't see the roots, and in this case, one of the biggest problems of any trees anywhere is 1, deep planting, and 2, what we call volcano mulching, both of which can suffocate the root system. And if you, no matter how good the tree looks above ground, if the tree is not visible or okay below ground, it actually might be a high risk, but not a visible hazard. You need to have a good professional who understands these things. Look at this for you. If you look at the orange in the picture on the lower right, that's snow fencing that was put there when the construction was done. If you look at the picture at the quality of the turf, somebody probably rolled it and sodded it. You need a professional to read the environment, read the tree, and read the site so you can determine if a tree is a low risk or a high risk. Then you can decide as a municipality if you have any risk tolerance, a tolerance for any risk at all. Some places don't, they can tolerate no risk. But if every tree that was considered a hazard tree under the current standards, there would be very few trees. We know as an industry in arboriculture that we've taken down way too many trees for way too long. And the idea is that the actual number of trees that fail is very small. And you need to have a careful look and evaluation. And this tree risk assessment protocol has a form which you systematically go through so you don't miss anything. And like on this city street, no doubt this tree got too big for its sidewalk coffin, its street tree pit, but who knows why it failed. Could have been high winds, because the simplest thing to remember that I will leave this discussion with is failure occurs when load exceeds strength. So you need either a strong wind load or a very high loss of strength. And you need a professional like a track person to make that evaluation. So sorry for the long-winded, but I'm not sorry.
Thank you, Neil. And we'll even get more into that when we talk about proper justification in a few slides about the professionals your municipality may want to bring on board.
Okay, so for exemptions, we discussed the general ones that are more applicable to everyone, but there are some that are specific to specific communities. So for example, a rural area may have exemptions for trees being cut down for firewood. Additionally, trees being cut down for septic system repairs, right? So we don't want to penalize folks for repairing their septic systems, because at that point we're balancing benefits of different resources. Community may have exemptions for the removal of invasive species. If you have a list of species or link to a list of species that are invasive and can be harmful to the environment or the species in your environment, you may not require a fee for removing them. Clearance for public utilities. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. Public utilities are a public benefit, and sometimes we need to make changes to install them. And one that I have seen, I've not put this in an ordinance, but I have seen this in other ordinances, that communities with golf courses may have tree removal exceptions for golf courses, based on the way that use or property type operates. So just an example. So there may be things specific to your community that I've not mentioned that may qualify or may be on this list as well. So I just wanted to mention that.
And just a quick addition, James, is that the reason we want to have eyes on these trees is a perfect example in our own municipality. I was called out to look at what I was told were all ash trees, and they all had to come down. There was one ash tree, and the tree company, I won't give them the credit of calling them arborists, went to the property and said, "Oh, all these are ash trees and have to come down." And there was one, and it was small. So somebody needs, when you're looking at these exemptions, if you're saying dead trees or ash trees are exempt, you still need to see them.
And that's a perfect segue, Neil, into this next section. The model ordinance does include text about proper justification shall be provided in writing to municipality, but it gives the flexibility of the municipality determining what that proper justification might be. So just in the example Neil mentioned, especially in the area we're located, a lot of times people need to remove ash trees. Well, most people maybe know what an ash tree is now, but in this case, the homeowner was being told that these are all ash trees that need to come out, and upon verification by the township, so in this case, that's what we require as proper justification. one of our township arborists will come out and verify the removal that's being proposed. In this case, that couldn't be verified by Neil because that in fact was not the case. So Neil, I'd like to turn over to you and to Rich to some options for municipalities of what they could include for proper justification, what might be appropriate, what's not appropriate. Like here it mentions photos. Well, in certain contexts that might be appropriate, but I would think also you'd recommend a site visit.
And I would, but Rich, do you have anything to add to that? I certainly am a big believer in site visits.
I think site visits are critical. I've had the same situation where I had tree companies tell property owners that this tree is going to be a problem, and it's certain species, and it really wasn't all that bad, where either pruning or treatment would have saved it. So the homeowner, unfortunately, kind of gets, I don't want to use the term hosed, but they get slanted by this, by the energy or the negative energy from the tree company. That's why having licensed tree companies is important to have someone go out there. But I always think the town needs to verify. Right now, I'm not plugging, but it's going to sound as though I am. There's 5 people with Richview Consulting, 5 professionals, and we're dealing with 12 towns. And a lot of these situations, we find, some discrepancy from what tree companies that are pushing a job. Some of them, many of them not licensed and just doing shady work. And unfortunately, the people in the town sort of get hosed by that. So you really need to have that site visit. It's important.
Thanks, Rich. And we've included here, this was in session 1. It was a resource by New Jersey Shade Tree Federation on some tree industry professionals that you can look into for your municipality. So, okay, section 5, enforcement. James, if you'd get us introduced here.
Yes. So enforcement is exactly what it sounds like. How do you penalize folks for breaking the rules, doing things without the proper permitting or without the proper notification? And so part of the ordinance details what that enforcement means. And in session 3, there's going to be an in-depth look at enforcement, different ways that this is done in different municipalities, et cetera. However, you would detail this in your ordinance.
Yeah, absolutely. This is going to be the focus of session 3, along with developing a permit process that'll work for your municipality. Because without some enforcement guidelines and personnel at the municipality to do so, your ordinance really doesn't have any teeth. You can come up with the greatest rules, the greatest replanting, but how are you, regulating that this is being done? And when people proceed without permit, how is that being regulated as well, which we're going to discuss in a moment with violations and penalties.
Okay. Similarly, I think this tags on well with enforcement. So section 5, you would detail your enforcement. Section 6, you would detail your violation and penalties after enforcement finds that somebody is doing something that is not permitted.
Thank you. And then the next slide here, we're just showing the text we have in the Reddington ordinance for our violations and penalties. Now, some of you that work in municipal, officials, any enforcement capacity, you're familiar with the violations and penalties section of an ordinance. And here, there were some questions earlier. It's important that you incentivize people to get the proper permits ahead of commencing work. So we all encounter or will encounter work without permit situations. So the fees should not match the same as they would pay, in your chart if they got the proper permit to commence the work initially. It should be higher. So in Reddington, we decided it's a surplus of 25% of whatever the work would have cost based on our tree removal and replacement fees. So we've added that 25% on. And also each tree constitutes a separate offense. So this has come up if this has to go all the way to municipal court. That's happened, very few times. Usually we can work with the property owner or business on the proper restitution and the replanting. But if not, and it has to go to court, you can actually write a separate summons for each tree the way our ordinance is written. So each stump we count, could be a separate offense the way our ordinance is written. So we'll talk more about that in session 3 of how to, specifically set some of your parameters. But we just wanted to introduce that here as it is part of the model ordinance template.
Okay. Severability is a legal term. It is a requirement of the ordinance. However, all ordinances should be prepared such that they're reviewed by an attorney. This is a term I would discuss with your attorney, but we're just letting you know that it is required as part of the ordinance.
Yeah. All right, and the final section, the effective date. So this is when the ordinance is in full effect. This will be at the end of your ordinance. James, do you want to just talk about this, how it generally falls into an ordinance format?
Yes. So the date of adoption is the date that it's adopted by the governing body. It's then approved by the appropriate, officials within the municipality who approve it, and then it goes into effect. I believe it's 20 days after the date of adoption. I had that written down somewhere. I'm sorry if I got that wrong, but it's in the municipal land use law, which would indicate when it goes in. So this, you adopt it, it's approved, and then it goes into effect within the statutory required time frame.
Thank you. And this slide was in session 1. We've just included it here again. James detailed the ordinance adoption process. I want to briefly speak to this, James.
Yes. So in the municipal land use law, especially if this becomes part of your land development or zoning ordinance, ordinances, any ordinance in that category requires 2 readings by the governing body separated by 10 days, at least 10 days. And it also has to be reviewed by the planning board. So when we think about timeframes, there's a statutory delay built in. So in addition to preparing your ordinance, getting your stakeholders together, you also have these mandatory separations and the need for, in the case of a planning or zoning ordinance, review by your planning board. So just things to keep in mind as you plan to adopt your ordinance.
Thank you, James. So we're at the end of our time here. We have a few more points to cover. So anyone who needs to get off, you have met the requirement for credit, if that is why you're attending today. We have session 3 that we've referenced many times, and the focus of that will be your permit process and enforcement at the municipal level. So we've discussed, the mandate of developing a tree ordinance today, the format of the model ordinance, and some modifications you may want to consider to customize it to your community. Next, it will be, all right, so how do you develop a permit process and proper enforcement at your municipality? So that will be on April 9th. The registration information for that will be coming out shortly. Again, we will email everyone on this session with that, but you can also, NJ Shade Tree will be sending that out, as well as NJAPZA. It'll be on our websites. So you'll see the registration information for that session coming out. We also, you'll get the slide deck. There is some links to some of the resources mentioned today. There were some questions in the chat about getting some of these resources. We will include the links. Also in the slide deck are the resources mentioned in session 1. So there's the links there to those resources as well. And we also have the contact information for the NJDEP stormwater permitting and water quality management. Now, there's information here on to find out your case manager. They're by county. There's also information, the email if you need to submit an ordinance that you'd like them to look at. So this slide was included in session 1, but is also included here in case you need to reference back to that information. So we don't have a ton of time for questions. We're over. But we may go through quickly and see if there's any reoccurring themes of some stuff we can address quickly here. From reviewing some of this, a lot of the questions that I see from the attendees of, can they change this? Can they prohibit volcano mulching is what I'm seeing right now. The answer is generally yes. You can tailor this to your community. Okay, let's see. We're just looking through. Do the panelists have any questions they're seeing that they'd like to address?
I've been trying to answer questions as I see them, as I can answer them.
Yes, thank you. I see in the chat that we can respond to people directly here. To answer any questions on the resources, yes, they'll be provided. The session video link will also be provided. Like last time, we will send the link and there will be a password. The session 1 will also be included there if you need to catch up. And there's some questions on the certificates. As mentioned in session 1, yes, we will be issuing like a general attendance certificate to everybody who attended for the full time, both for session 1 and then now a separate for session 2. We're still managing how that is going to work for us because we do have a lot of people on these calls, but we do have all that information in the Zoom attendance reports. So if you attended session 1 and you're waiting on that, please just be patient. We're addressing it. And same thing for session 2. If you attended today and stayed on for the full session, you will be getting your certificate issued. So we're working on that process behind the scenes here, NJAPZA and NJ Shade Tree Federation together.
And also, we got 2 Shade Tree Commission questions. So one, yes, it can be reviewed by the Shade Tree Commission. I mentioned the Planning and Zoning Board just due to the nature of my work. So Shade Tree Commissions can review some of these things, but the ordinance has to be structured for that. And adopting this ordinance as a new section of an already adopted ordinance called Rules and Regulations of the Shade Tree Commission, yes, I believe that is allowable. For example, Lambertville has a Shade Tree Commission section where they include this information, which is separate from their zoning or planning ordinance. So yes, you can do that. So just want to note that for those who saw a couple of questions there.
And Neil, I know we've gone through this in our municipality. I see a question on checking if a tree company is licensed. I know there's a database that you check. Maybe we can send that link out with the resources.
Yeah, that's very important. In order to, I think we mentioned it in session 1, but in order to operate in any municipality in the state, a tree company must be licensed and it must be registered. In order to be registered, there has to be a person, either what's called an LTCO, a licensed tree care expert, which is sort of minimal qualification. You can do removals and I believe some pruning, and that's it. If you the higher qualification is the licensed tree expert. We believe it's the most challenging and highly qualified tree expert in the country. That's what you'd like to have as someone in your town. It used to be called a CTE, certified tree expert. That was changed when it became state mandated, the law some years ago, and now it's licensed tree expert. So you must be registered to operate in the state of New Jersey. So for example, we talk about our town a lot. I hear a chipper or a chainsaw and I drive, if I'm out, to the site and look for the registration number on the truck. If I don't see it, I call it into the board of tree experts who have inspectors. And if you're not registered, the fines start, I believe, at $500. And we've caught a couple because in our industry, and I'm sure Rich would reinforce this, we are trying to raise the bar to have competent people who are not going to cause harm to your trees or to your insurance or your own liability. So that's why every tree company must be registered. If you see a tree company operating or anybody operating without a registration number, call the New Jersey Board of Tree Experts, take a picture. That's always the best thing, and then send that to them. There's an opportunity to attach it to an email, and someone will be checking on them to make sure they're legit.
Thanks, Neil. And we'll talk about this in session 3, but our permit requirements, if the homeowner is hiring someone to do the work, they're required to give us the name and the license number. So that can be checked proactively, because sometimes, as Rich was highlighting, these homeowners are not being told the full story or given all the information, and they might think they're working with somebody that is licensed to do this work, and they might not be. So we've had some situations where we've advised the applicant that, hey, the company you're proposing to use, we're not seeing them registered here. And in some cases, that was news to the homeowner. So a few other questions here about like links to the case manager thing. You will get a copy of the slides, so the links will be active and you'll be able to utilize those directly from the presentation. So anything you missed, don't worry about that. You'll be able to access it later. Neil or Rich, will you be able to answer this one? What is the difference between an LTE and a certified forester?
Oh, there's a huge difference, Rich, unless you want to answer that. You're muted.
You're muted, Rich.
You're still muted.
Yeah,
So
one
Okay,
of
there
these
you go.
days, I'll remember to press the buttons first. Basically, a certified forester is a designation from the Society of American Foresters whose work basically would involve forests, not necessarily urban landscape. An LTE, LTCO, licensed tree expert, is one that does more of individual tree care, arboriculture type of work that would be more appropriate for municipal or private entities or customers, as opposed to woodlot owners.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot
Right,
of different designations.
and rarely do they overlap. I've split a career between forestry and arboriculture, and they don't really overlap. So what you're really looking for is a licensed tree expert. And if you have a woodland, then you're looking for a forester.
Right. Well, I want to, and I apologize, I couldn't get my video to restart here again, but I want to thank our panelists again today, to Rich, to Neil, to James, for being with us for session 2. Neil and James returning from session 1. It's been a lot of work behind the scenes and preparation for these sessions, so I really want to thank both of them for lending their time and talents to us again today. So thank you for joining us. To all the attendees on the line, we will be following up with all the resources mentioned, the video links, the slides. Just do be patient, as it takes us some time to get that all together and make sure we're giving you a comprehensive post-session package there. Any questions in between, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, stay tuned for registration information for session 3, which should be released sometime next week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Take care.
Christina. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Nice work, folks. That went quick this time.
That was nice.
Good. Glad you think so. Thanks, Christina, as always.
Yeah. Okay, I'm stopping the session.